Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, baby metal, and other Japanese bands fan. I'm going to do something a little different today, just for a bit of fun. Fun for me, at least. It might not be for anybody else. I have been watching a bunch of like YouTube videos and things by people who talk about what it's like to live in Japan, and I thought, well, it would be interesting for me to do something similar, but to talk not about what Japan is like now, if you're a foreigner, but what Japan was like when I first went there, um, nearly 35 years ago, um, when it was a very different place and the world was a very different place, and we don't have the kind of knowledge and the way of finding things out that we carry around in our pockets that we do today, and and I thought, rather than simply talking about this myself, it might be fun to reconnect with an old friend who I knew while I was there, and we would have a conversation about it. Um, and that's what I've done. And it's personal and it's nostalgic, and it's digressive, wanders around all over the place. So you may or may not find it interesting. And I'm deliberately leaving it pretty much as it is, rather than trying to streamline it and edit it and add in pictures and stuff like that. It's a conversation, so I'm just going to leave it as that. And I hope you have some fun with it. So, yeah, here we go. My guest today is an old friend of mine, Jaime Cortez, and who I've known for since the early 14th
Punic
century.
Wars.
Yeah, the Punic Wars, exactly. And Jaime is a writer and a visual artist, and this year he published this collection of short stories called Gordo. All the stories are connected. They're set mostly in the very sort of autobiographical stories set mostly in a migrant worker camp in California in the 70s. Beautiful stories, touching, funny. I strongly recommend this collection, and it's making a lot of best of year lists, I notice. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Jaime did a little Zoom session like this in my creative writing class a month or so ago, and the students absolutely loved him, loved the book, loved his reading of the story. It made me think after the fact that I wish I'd recorded that, and then I could post you doing. Have you done any sort of recorded readings, or is that just a live
There's
thing?
recordings out there. I can send you some links.
That would be great. I'd love to be able to share those. So again, get this. It's really good. The end. Okay, so now Jaime doesn't really know what's going on, and frankly, neither do I. But the idea for this came out of the fact that in the last year or two, I've been posting a lot of videos with Japanese connections, content, music stuff, and other bits of things. And I've been watching, this is a symptom of the pandemic, watching a lot of YouTube stuff in which people talk about living in Japan and things like that. And it occurred to me that all of that stuff, much of which is really interesting, but it's all very contemporary. It's all present day or recorded in the last few years. And it occurred to me that what I haven't seen is people talking about what it was like to go and live as foreigners in Japan in the days before the internet, the days before cell phones, the days before people really knew what the hell they were going to when they went out there. And so I thought it might be fun to have a conversation. Jaime, we met in 1987, is that right?
I think it was 87, August of 87.
August of 87. We met in Tokyo. We were both participants on the JET program, the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program. I was coming from the UK, Jaime was coming from California. And I want to say that the JET program was only maybe 2 years old at that point.
The year that we arrived was a year that marked a significant expansion in the size of the JET program, and it jumped to. I know that I think the year that we were there, it was 700 or 900 of us that were scattered across the country, and in previous years it had been far, far fewer.
Yeah, I know of only. We lived in a town called Kofu in Yamanashi, which was a couple of hours west of Tokyo. Well, it still is. And, yeah, and I believe there was only one person on the JET program in that town the year before we went. And the year that we arrived, I think the group of us in the whole prefecture of Yamanashi was about 8 or 9. Is that right?
There were 9 of us, I think.
9.
And I think when we arrived, we tripled the foreigner population in the prefecture because, as it turns out, Yamanashi was considered a very rural prefecture by Japanese standards because, of course, the population density in Japan is high. Kofu, the capital city, at the time was like 250,000 people, I think, which for a prefectural capital in Japan is not considered a big city. Yeah. In most countries, that would be a pretty good sized city, but in Japan, that was not considered a big capital.
Right, and apart from Kofu itself, most of there weren't really a lot of big towns, right? And the big draw. Kofu is on the landlocked side of Mount Fuji. Mount Fuji sort of. All the views that you see in pictures of Mount Fuji are either from the Yamanashi side or from the Shizuoka side, which is the coastal side. So one of the big draws for Yamanashi is the what do you call them? The Kawaguchiko and the other. What do you call the 5 towns? Towns?
Yeah, they were like I can't remember what.
I can't remember. There's a name for a particular group of towns on the Yamanashi side at the foot of Mount Fuji. But we could see Mount Fuji from Kofu, from the balcony of my apartment. On a clear day, I could see Fuji right above.
I could see it too from my apartment. There was that, but the other thing was also that it was a grape growing prefecture, and it kind of had that reputation as well of growing table grapes and wine grapes. Where I live nearby, the hillside was covered in vineyards, and it was quite a pretty and familiar thing for me as a person from California. Like it was like, oh yeah, I know this.
And this is part of one of the things that I want to get into. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have not been back to Japan.
I have not been back
since. Okay, so because we were there for 2 years, we were there initially on a 1-year contract. We both opted to extend that contract for a 2nd year. We were the only ones of that group?
I think there were others, and I can't remember who from the first cohort came back for another year. I think most of us did, if I remember correctly, or maybe half-ish. Is that right? Now I'm not sure. Okay.
I'm not sure. I mean, I only remember a few of us because even though it was a small group, I only knew the ones who lived in and are very close to Kofu in that first year. You and like 3 others, all of whom I've completely lost touch with. And then the year after, the group got massive, much larger. It went up to like 30 or something like that, didn't it?
Year 2's group was not that much bigger. What was the size, more or less? It wasn't 30. I don't think it was that big.
It wasn't that big?
No.
Okay, so the first thing that we're learning here is that my memory is faulty, as is often the case with things like this. So
maybe it was just that the 2nd year cohort had bigger personalities and they seemed like 30 people.
They were a much more cohesive group. They spent a lot more time together.
Yes.
Because I mean, we were like 2 of the only people who really sort of spent a lot of time together that first year.
Yes, it's true. Yeah, that is true. Yeah, the 2nd years seem to be much more chummy with each other.
Yeah,
with us.
Yeah. So, how did you come to be there? What made you apply in the first place? What was the process like?
Well, as a high school kid, I was a library kid, and I spent a lot of time just lurking around the stacks at the Watsonville Public Library. And, I, just in the wonderful way that you can do when you're going through stacks, you just develop all these different kinds of interests.
Mm.
And one of the things that really kind of drew me was I love the art books. And I started checking out the books of Japanese art, and I got very fascinated with ukiyo-e, the famed block prints of Japan. Um, and then with the other forms as well, the sculpture and the ceramics. And so I had this kind of fascination with it. Um, and then as a college student, I started reading some Japanese literature as well. I was very intrigued with Yukio Mishima's work and Kobo Abe's work. And there was something about it that just felt so interesting to me. Just culturally, it was so interesting. This, of course, again, I think we're going to probably keep hitting on this theme of what pre-internet means for these choices and stuff. But at this point, liking Japanese culture for a teenage kid is almost a given. Like it's such a thing for them, and it's propagated through media, through the popularity of their anime and the art and the food. It all kind of is something that's really a common thing. Back then, it was more esoteric. I think it was possible to be a nerd about things back then in a way that it's very hard to be a nerd anymore. Because if you like this one particular era of early 80s anime, you're going to find 10,000 people in a club already online who are into that very particular thing. So I think nerddom is I think the true nerd is a vanishingly rare creature at this point.
That's really interesting.
But I think that back then, I think it was possible to nerd out on things, and I was kind of nerding out on the culture. And so, in college, in my junior year, I just noticed flyers about going to teach in Japan, and this seemed to me like the most stunning thing. Like, wait a minute, people actually go there without Japanese language skills, and they work and they get to be there. Oh, that's incredible. So I was very excited by this prospect, and I can't remember what the channel back then was for finding these the places to apply to, but I got some kind of handbook or something from the career office, and I sent out over 60 cover letters and a little resume, the resume of a 22-year-old, and I sent it out to over 60 places. One private school responded and asked to have an interview. And amazingly, the one that I most wanted, which was the Japan Exchange Teaching Program sponsored by Monbusho, the Ministry of Education, was the other one that was interested. So I happily signed on the dotted line to come to the JET program.
Were you interviewed?
I was interviewed. Yes, it might have been at the consulate it might have been at the consulate in San Francisco, maybe, but I might be making that up because that's what happens over the decades. You start inventing things.
Well, I had a similar experience because, and I think I was probably even less informed about Japan than you were. I had no idea, and I was coming out of I was finishing my English degree, and I had friends who were going to go and teach abroad, but they were all going to Europe, and they all were people who were majoring in French or Spanish or German or Italian or whatever. And I didn't have those. I mean, I had some of those languages, French, but my French wasn't very good. I couldn't compete with those people. So when I saw the Japan thing, I thought, well, nobody speaks Japanese. I mean, in 1987 in the UK, that was true, right?
Yeah.
So I applied with those same sort of ideas about old Japanese, prints and things like that. Those were the things that I was excited about, and it was this sort of very esoteric and exotic, if that's not a problematic word.
At least for a young person, it just felt that way, didn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And I had absolutely no clue, and I applied for it, and I was interviewed at the Japanese embassy in London, and that of itself, for me, a lad from Preston who was at University in Manchester, of itself, that was an adventure. Going to London, going to London on the train and being interviewed, and it was almost comic, because I was absolutely clueless. I remember them asking me questions about Japanese history, and I just had absolutely no idea at all, But somehow I got it. I suspect because at that point, not that many people, as you said, they were massively expanding the program, and there weren't that many applicants. I believe it's become much, much more competitive. But I had no Japanese language. I had no real concept of what the hell I was going to,
Yes.
and so it's probably one of the reasons that we sort of immediately, bonded, because you were, somebody I could talk to, and it
was a low bar.
What?
It was a low bar. I could talk to this person.
Well, it was a low bar though, but because I remember, and we'll maybe talk about that the first week or so in Tokyo, but I remember when we left Tokyo, being sort of, we traveled by bus to Kofu, and I had my sort of teacher mentor, Kawakami sensei, who was sort of looking after me. And we went to Kofu, and he said, here's the school, here's your apartment, here's how you work the bath and stuff like that, and here's where the nearest grocery store is, and here's a bicycle. See you in 6 weeks. Because we arrived, you said, it might not have been 6 weeks, but it was a while before school actually started. And I knew nobody.
I forgot that there was a window of time before school started. Yeah.
It was, and I didn't have your contact information, and we met and connected.
We didn't have phone service yet. We hadn't hooked it up.
We had nothing. And again, no internet, no cell phones. And so I didn't speak the language. I lost something like 20 pounds very quickly because I had no idea what any of the food was. I didn't understand how much I was being paid, and everything seemed incredibly expensive. So I was...
Yeah, the sticker shock was real.
Right. There was a sort of standing joke between us when we would walk around and see the price of something, and you'd say, I could put a down payment on a peach for that.
That's right. We said that.
Because everything was so expensive, and I just didn't know how much we were getting paid, and I didn't know what we could afford, and I didn't understand the money. We had to pay everything in cash. We had to go and get a little Hanko stamp and stuff. So I was absolutely clueless. And I remember the first week or so, I barely spoke to a human being. I was in my apartment and I didn't know what to do. And I remember sitting there thinking, this was a colossal mistake. I should not have done this. And I'm stuck here for a year.
Wow. I had like a different experience. I remember arriving, and like you, I was thinking, here's your apartment. Here's how you use the fudo, the bath. Too bad no one told me how to use the squat toilet. That would have been like really useful, because it took me, I don't know, a year and a half. It took a while. Anyways, so they were like teaching you, your basics, and here's where you take your recycling and garbage, and I remember just getting on my bicycle, and I had my Walkman, my cassette Walkman, and I put on it was U2's Joshua Tree album, and the song Where the Streets Have No Name came on, and I was bicycling and not unknowing how to read any of the street signs. And it was like, it's that moment when life gives you the perfect soundtrack for your moment.
Yeah.
And I was deliriously lost and happy. I
Yeah.
was so happy. It was one of the few times in my life where I felt like this is exactly where I'm supposed to be.
Wow. I think I
I've
came to
only I've
that.
only ever felt that maybe once or twice again in my whole life.
Mm, that's
So
really
I had
interesting.
a really like delicious, like that first day of bicycling, and it was summer and it rains there in the summer,
Yeah.
as it does in very humid places, and just biking in the rain and being ecstatic. Yeah,
That's
quietly.
great.
It was
It took me a
great.
while to get there.
Yeah.
I was incredibly homesick. And you know, and even when they did hook up the phones, I was terrified that I wouldn't be able to pay the bill. So I didn't want to call the UK, right? And so I was like, yeah, it was hard, man. It was it was hard. And it was funny that you mentioned the soundtrack thing because I remember one of my first purchases there, CDs had just become a thing, and I
Yes.
remember buying a little CD player in Japan. And so I then went out and started buying CDs, and one of the first CDs that I bought in Japan was Sting's "Nothing Like the Sun" album, which had just come out.
Yeah, I love that album. We used to listen
Yeah,
to it.
yeah, and you remember, and the song "Englishman in New York,"
Yes.
and that became my signature song for that sense of being sort of constantly out of place, not quite belonging, and you know,
Interesting. Yes.
and it was funny because you know one of the things that I didn't go back. We were there, as you said, we were there for 2 years, and I didn't go back for like a decade. Um, and I've been back several times since. But initially, I didn't go back for like 10 years. I was in graduate school, and you know, various things going on, and getting married and so on. And then eventually we went back, and I realized how much of my experience of Japan that I remembered was about being in Japan at a specific moment, because
Hmm.
that moment had long since gone. And you know, my memories of Kofu, which, as you said, was considered a sort of provincial town, but everything seemed shiny and new, and there was a sort of glow about everything, and it felt like being at Disney World or something, you know.
Yes.
There was a sort of polish and a sort of, and especially coming from Northern England, you know, where
Yeah.
we don't, there's no such thing as customer service, or there wasn't, you know.
Yes.
Everybody being sort of perky and happy all the time was like landing on another planet. But when I went back in like the very late 90s, and the economy had collapsed, and Kofu was not like that anymore, and all those big lavish department stores were like boarded up, and or had been sold off into other sort of thing. Parts of this town were really quite seedy and run down, and it made me completely reevaluate, because in my mind everything about Japan had it was just Japan. It was just, but when I went back, I realized that it was about Japan at a particular time, that sort of economic explosion in the 80s that made everything
Yeah, I
prosperous.
think it's true because I didn't experience it again until I was in San Francisco, living in San Francisco during the first .com boom, uh,
Mm,
where it's the feeling that you had in Tokyo, and I understand it now. I didn't understand it then. What you were feeling was the energy of vast amounts of money pumping through a city.
yeah,
That was the energy I think that I was perceiving, and it's not just the energy of a big population densely packed together. It was something different, and I understand now that that was just about being where the money is concentrating and circulating. Years later in San Francisco, I got that feeling when when the .com economy was eating up the whole region of Northern California, including San Francisco, and like, oh, that's what that was. It wasn't
right,
just the population density.
yeah,
It was
yeah,
that
yeah.
thing.
And that sense of being sort of there at a particular moment. The other thing that I noticed that changed radically when we went back, even within just that 10 years, is that even in relatively small towns, nobody responded to our foreignness anymore.
Oh, that's different. Yes.
And one of the strange things that we experienced was that even in Tokyo, there just were not very many foreigners, and people reacted visibly with shock and sometimes suspicion, sometimes delight. Just you saw them in the street, right? Or you'd be in an elevator in a department store and the doors would open and the people outside would be like, oh my God, you know? But people—
That was in Tokyo?
I mean, I remember the first time it happened, we were in Tokyo. And I was like,
Okay.
what is going on? You
Oh,
know?
wait. Oh, you mean back in when we arrived?
Yes, when we were there. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It was like, especially when there would be a herd of us in Kofu and we were going out to have drinks or dinner or something. It was like the circus parade. It was just like people from half block away were like, and little kids were just unabashedly staring, like,
Yeah.
oh my God.
Yeah.
Uh,
People coming up to you,
yeah, because
touch
I
your
remember
hair.
that
Yeah.
sense of like the constant sense of spectacle that we were.
And a lot of the time it was sort of fun, but there was also a sense that the moment you stepped out of your apartment, you were public property. You know, that there was no— and I remember, you know, teachers coming up to me and saying, oh, somebody told me that they saw you riding your bike in such and such a part of the town late at night singing.
You were buying onions and a tuna steak in such and such town.
Yeah.
Which they don't usually see you there, so they're wondering what you were doing there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so yeah, that was in some ways, Andrew. It's you know, like right now, coming back again to social media and how that shifted everything. Right now, many people are able to enjoy small C celebrity, and they pursue it voraciously, right? We were kind of experiencing small C celebrity before the internet.
Yeah.
And I think there is a way that like we were scrutinized constantly out of curiosity, but then also out of the kind of suspicion of the outsider. I think that was on us as well. And sometimes a kind of just a cultural fascination, you know, which is understandable. And it was a kind of small scale celebrity.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, people would walk up to you and start talking to you in the street just randomly, and other people would do the opposite. They would immediately get all shy and embarrassed, and yeah, it was an odd thing. It was, and that's completely gone. Certainly the last few times, I mean, when you're in very small towns in the middle of nowhere where they're just not used to seeing foreigners, people will respond, but they don't respond like they did when we were there. You know, very different experience.
That's interesting. And that shifted fast.
Yeah.
Because that's only like a decade.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess that was all. I mean, it's part of the reason we were there, right? This whole internationalization thing that was driving the JET program. That's why it was existing. This idea of somehow
they are always throwing around that term internationalization, and I can't remember for the life of me the Japanese word for it, but it was constantly being tossed about.
Yeah.
They had it was again the economy, like, so you have what at the time was the second kind of largest economy in the world, and it was seen as probably the most dynamic one as well, because at that time companies like Sony, for instance, were world beaters. They were the best of their category. And so you had these industries that were really exploding internationally, and I think they realized that their homegrown Japanese workforce was not up to the task of being the global economic power that they were becoming, you know, with each passing month. The economy was growing so fast. So I think there was a lot of anxiety about like, how do we prepare our own homegrown workforce for this? Because we need to be able to function everywhere. And one of the key ways of making that happen is because English is the lingua franca of international business. That was the key that they felt to unlock that particular door, is to just get more English mastery and familiarity and comfort with English speaking foreigners. So
yeah, I mean, whether it worked or not is another question. I mean, one of the other things that I would notice when we've been back more recently is that I think there are more people scattered around, in railway stations and kenshos and tourist offices and stuff who speak really good English. But the majority of people's English is no better than it was when we were there.
Yeah.
So, and that sense of, I remember people saying that they felt like they were being used as sort of pronunciation machines.
Yes.
The mode of teaching English never changed.
Yeah.
It was still sort of rote memorization and this sort of very archaic dead language kind of approach, And
I will say that most of my high school students could out diagram a sentence over me any day. Like they could do that really well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But not necessarily speak it.
But yeah, I think the other thing too, Andrew, that was, you talked about the homesickness piece. I think that one of the things too that we experienced, and that within less than a decade, people would no longer experience as foreigners living in Japan, is the feeling of really going away. Because we were not in regular video contact. We were not getting daily posts and updates from family members and friends and home that kind of kept us current and connected. We experienced really going away. And I think when you go from one industrialized country to another industrialized country now, you don't have to go away. You can if you want to, but you have to actually work at it to go away. Whereas for us, there was no other option. We were writing letters, or we were making extremely expensive phone calls home once in a while. So that was it.
I think you're right. We were cut off from international news. I had no idea what was going on in the UK. We were cut off from other elements of culture, TV. I mean, movies came, right? You and I used to go to the movies a lot.
I go to the movies a lot. That was a really regular thing. I would watch the news all the time. I just liked watching and listening and see what I could make out of it. So through that, I would watch NHK News a lot. And that kind of gave me a vague idea that things were happening. I remember when the Berlin Wall came down while we were in Japan. I remember just seeing the video, and I had a pretty good idea of what was happening.
That happened while we were in Japan?
That happened while we were in Japan.
Wow.
I remember watching the news and the next morning going to the teacher's room, and unusually, actually, so for those who have never seen at least the kind of teacher's room we were in, it's the what they call the open plan kind of space. There's no offices except for maybe the principal and vice principal. Mm-hmm. Everyone else is in a big open space. The desks are right up against each other. Yep. You have people right to your left, right in front of me, and right behind you. It's all very packed in. But I remember going into the teacher's room, and very unusually, they had the TV on. And it was the Berlin Wall thing happening as well. And everybody was like slack-jawed, like, holy Toledo, I can't believe this is actually happening.
Yeah.
So I remember that news day in particular, because they didn't usually keep the TV in the teacher's room. That was unusual.
That's fascinating. I think I have memories of seeing the footage, but I have no memory of seeing it in Japan. I don't know if that's interesting. The one thing that I do remember as far as a news thing while we were there was the death of the emperor.
Oh.
And I remember, and somehow that happened. And I used to go to a little corner shop on my way to school every day and pick up something to eat. And somehow I knew that the emperor had died before the people in the shop. So they had this rather bizarre experience of being told by a gaijin that the emperor who had defined Japan since before the Second World War had just died. And this was like a big turning point in terms of the...
It was Hirohito?
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. I forgot that happened while we were there. I thought it happened after.
No, we were there. I remember because the first year of the new era, right, Heisei Genren, was announced while we were there, the Heisei era. I remember talking to Japanese people about what they thought of the new name. Yeah.
The other thing that I remember as kind of very major while we were there internationally was the Olympics happened. And I remember, because I remember being there at home in my little apartment and my tiny TV, watching the glorious Florence Griffith Joyner just burn up the tracks in track and field. It was an unforgettable kind of sight to see her in her prime. But I remember the Olympics as well. That was another big thing.
I don't think I mean, did you had a little Japanese when you went out there?
I think it's very generous to say I had a little Japanese.
I mean, I think you probably had a little bit more.
I could like hold in my hand all the Japanese I had. So, I mean, I tried for months, but
yeah.
Beyond the very most rudimentary things, as soon as the thing is that like, apparently I had a pretty good accent. And so I would say my basic 2 or 3 things in a pretty good accent, and the assumption was that I could speak a lot better, and they would just kind of jump right into conversation. That would be lost. Yeah.
I remember, the first day of school and being sort of brought up onto the stage with like these hundreds of kids. And my school, the main school, was an all-boys school. So they're all out there in their sort of Prussian army uniforms, or whatever the school uniform was based on. And as I'm being led up to the stage, one of the teachers turned around to me and said, "Go to the microphone and introduce yourself in Japanese." And I thought I was going to die. I've never been so scared in all my life. I never felt like the sort of utter fraud. I mean, I felt that many times while we were there, but
I mean, really, we had no business teaching.
We absolutely zero qualifications.
We had no business teaching.
And all I had to say, Andrew Hartley desu, yoroshiku onegaishimasu, or something, right? But it was this incredible face. I was like absolutely terrified, and then they all sort of cheered, and it was so surreal. And again, it was like that sort of minor celebrity thing, and I was just like, what is happening? Where am I? What? And the language thing continued to be an issue. I think, I thought of myself as reasonably well traveled, right? Because I'd been sort of all over Europe, but always for little time. I'd spent a few weeks in Israel as an archaeologist, but most of my other travel was just around Europe, and it was all vacation type travel. And most of those languages are sort of related to each other. So you see a billboard or a newspaper headline, and even if you don't speak the language, you can frequently sort of figure out the gist of kind of what's going on, And I was completely unprepared for my level of ignorance in Japan, that I assumed that over time I would just sort of absorb the language. I would sort of pick it all up. And it was only when I got there that I realized that the billboards and stuff made zero sense. Just a bunch of squiggles. I had no idea what anything meant. And so I wasn't retaining the language. And I had to sort of sit down and study it, and I was taking classes and stuff, but still it was like pulling teeth.
I watched a lot of children's programming, and in particular on TV, I would look for the programming for very small kids. The vocabulary level was more accessible, and then the speed with which they were speaking was a little easier to follow. So I was all about whatever their version of Sesame Street was, because it just felt like the most helpful thing.
Were we watching like Doraemon? The
Yes, I watched Doraemon.
Yes. And Ampan Man and stuff like that. Do you remember?
Yes, I would watch Doraemon, and I really enjoyed Gegege Mokitaro.
Yes.
The most surreal cartoon, even by Japanese standards. That was really fucking surreal. The kid who chases monster, and his father is an eyeball that lives in his hair.
Yeah. It's fantastic. I mean, and that version of Japan is one of the things I still love about it. all that sort of the sort of the pop version of that sort of yokai culture and all the sort of strangeness of it, and it fit perfectly because my daily life was surreal
It
in
was
Japan.
surreal.
You know, I
So
mean,
so often it was the feeling I felt like so I felt blown out of my own body and like I was walking through a diorama of something sometimes. That's how it felt
yeah,
sometimes. It was like, is this like like a stage set or
yeah,
something to me? It felt so different, so incredibly different. Just, and so many delights. I mean, we were
yeah.
talking about cartoons. I used to love that the one cartoon series called Oishimbo, which was a cartoon series about, I think he was a food critic. And it was just about different kinds of food.
Yeah.
And so here's the episode about curry, and they just unpack curry. Like, here's where it comes from, here's the variations, here's
That's
how
right.
we like it. And then they would do like a very anime drama style video, like cartoon of someone preparing, a curry. So, and every episode was just about like one kind of food, and it was fantastic. I really loved that show. And of
But
course,
I think you're right, that sense of constantly living in a world that didn't feel entirely real, or to in which we didn't entirely belong, I think stayed with me a lot. And I remember, I'm sure I told you this story. One day I was sitting in my bath and I hear the front door open, and I sort of get out of the bath and put something on and look out, and there is a woman who is maybe 80 years old standing in my kitchen staring at me, and she'd followed me home from the supermarket.
I never heard this story.
Yeah, and I was just like completely freaked out. I've got I've got a towel around myself, and she just stands there and stares at me, and I'm like, this is my house, sort of thing. And eventually she goes outside, and I waited a few minutes, and then I sort of opened the front door, and she was standing next to the front door with her face up against the wall, like 2 inches away, standing there motionless. And I just sort of closed the door and locked it. And
Yeah.
and little things like that, these sort of dreamlike, surreal experiences happened on a fairly regular basis. This
Yes.
that sense of not being in a and it's really hard to explain because I'm not trying to suggest that somehow it wasn't real or that the people weren't real or anything like that, but they were experiencing in a weird kind of way the same culture shock that I was feeling.
Yes.
My presence, by definition, was disruptive,
Yeah.
and
Well, and
sometimes that was a good thing, sometimes it wasn't.
I think also for you, because of your appearance, um, like depending on whether she was old enough to have been a kid during World War II, who knows what your appearance means to her, right?
Yeah,
It's hard to know with the older folks in Japan.
yeah.
I thought about that often, and interestingly, that kind of really came home to me when I don't think you were with me when we were in Korea together or not.
We were in Korea together, at
We
least
were, okay.
briefly. Yes,
Okay, briefly, and then
with Alan.
I can't remember now, but
Finey and I went.
one of the things that was interesting was knowing that older Korean people had actually been taught Japanese when the Japanese invaded and occupied. And sometimes I would resort to that, to using Japanese in order to communicate with an older person, in a restaurant or at a store or something. And boy, was that a mistake.
Mm,
Yeah,
yeah,
that language only has horrific memories attached to it for them.
yeah.
And so, it made me also think about, our presence in a place where the older people could remember that. And where you would see things like, one of the things that was very poignant to me was at the school I taught at, our elder teachers, that this was in the 80s, and the elder teachers were people in their 60s. And compared to the students were so much bigger than the teachers on average, than the elder teachers. It was like a whole different world of size.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, oh, wow, that's like a whole generation that experienced post-war malnutrition. And their growth was stunted by that.
Yeah.
And you see the kids, and it's almost like you almost can't believe that these kids came from these previous generations, because the size differential was vast.
Yeah.
Vast.
You met my father-in-law. I remember him coming to visit in Japan.
Yeah, very briefly.
Yeah, and you met him at least at our wedding in the UK as well. And he tells, because he was a child in Japan during the war.
Okay.
And he tells stories because he was lived on in a small town, a rural town in the south, and he tells stories about taking vegetables into the city, because nobody had any food.
Yes.
And taking food from the farms and such around to distribute after bombings and things like that. So yeah, I think you're right. Though for my experience was still very in my own way, I think extremely sort of provincial. And I remember getting once or twice, rarely, because most of the time people were incredibly welcoming and friendly, but once or twice, so. I remember getting like yelled at for like no reason. I was just sort of cycling along, and an old person would start screaming at me. And I remember talking to the teachers at school about it, and they said the same thing that you're saying. So, well, maybe they have an association connected to the war or something. And I was very indignant about it, and like, well, it's not my fault. And I could tell you horror stories about people I knew who were in Japanese prison camps, blah blah blah. But that was just there was an odd sense of that. There's a positive and a negative sense to feeling like you don't belong, right? That you start to feel like none of the rules really apply to you because it's not your culture.
I had a kind of a complex response to that experience because, my parents were immigrants to the United States from Mexico. And I remember just, those years of being a kid and growing up, and to me, it was always an open question: are we or are we not really Americans? Are we or are we not welcome here?
Yeah,
that was always a question, and I felt like I grew up being somewhere in between, like thinking we are and are not of this place. And then going to Japan and quickly realizing that, oh, you can't become Japanese. Nobody becomes Japanese. You either are or you aren't, because it's not just an acculturation thing, it's a racialized thing as well.
Yeah.
So we could live there for 60 years, we'd still be the foreigner.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there was something about just how clean that was. I actually found it very comforting. Like, okay, we're the foreigners. We are not expected to know the subtleties of courtesy. Like, we can have courtesy in the bluntest, broadest sense. Like, we know to say thank you, excuse me, I'm sorry. But because Japan is so very, very nuanced in the way people interact because of the hierarchies that are built in around age and gender and job position. They're very nuanced, very subtle. They have different language forms that are used. So women speak with certain kinds of vocabulary that men don't use. There's certain honorific endings that you put at the end of words to suggest respect, to suggest someone's superior or subordinate position. All of those nuances, we were not expected to be responsible for knowing that. It was too refined, too sophisticated for us. And so we were just these blunt kind of creatures that, stomped about in Japan. So.
Yeah. I think that, one of the things that I struggled with is that, I remember you and I both, early in our first year, we bought decent cameras.
Yes.
and there was that sense, right, that every day was a photo opportunity.
Yes.
You know, that just walking around, you wanted to have a camera with you because you were going to always see these extraordinary things. And for me, there was always that sense also that you're going to see these extraordinary things that you will never see again, because eventually you're going to go home. And to me, there was that sense, and again, this is sort of the limitations of my own background, I think, not the fault of anybody except myself, but to go home as being a return to normality, you know? And I think one of the things that I found hardest was that when I did go home, that was a much harder transition than going to Japan had been in the first place. The reverse culture shock was in many ways more destabilizing than the initial culture shock, you know, because I had become accustomed to the very strangeness that we're talking about, and I expected to go home and just sort of slot back into the normal life that I had grown up with, and realized that I had become a completely different person and no longer fitted in there either.
Yeah, it took me a while to stop bowing as I talked.
Mm.
That was like, that went on for a long time. And you know, at the last several months of the time that we were in Japan, of course, you and I were always hanging out. And then we traveled together. I came back to California, and, you know, talking to Patty, my younger sister, at one point she says, Jaime, number one, you need to speak up. You don't need to bow. And why are you speaking with a British accent?
Yeah, I mean, we spent a lot of time together, and as you say, not just in Japan, we were in Hong Kong together, right?
We were in Hong Kong, and then we were in
went to
Nepal.
India and Nepal.
India.
Yeah, which was a long and occasionally difficult trip.
That was something.
Yeah, it
I
was.
always remember it. Yeah.
Well, maybe we'll do it. We'll do a video on that.
And of course, like we became regulars at the jazz bar Alone. It was called Alone, and I have
still there.
Many. It's still there.
Still there. Last time we were there, last time Finey and I and Sebastian were there, and I've been back twice, and the first time we went back, the master was there, same guy.
Oh my
They
God.
had a little stage built in the corner now for live acts, but he was there. The last time we went, he still ran it, but he wasn't there the night that we were there. I didn't get to speak to him. But yeah, and that was only a couple of years ago.
Do you remember his name?
We always just called him the Master.
Oh, okay.
Which makes him sound like a Doctor Who villain, but but yeah, it's funny because when we did see him, and this was first time that we took Sebastian, so it would have been about 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And we went in, and his face sort of he recognized me right away.
Wow.
And before anything happened, he poured me a vodka and lime and put Dave Berg back on. Yeah.
Oh man, you that must have melted you.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was that was an extraordinary trip because, as I say, the previous times that we'd been, it had been in some ways quite depressing, and I had found myself feeling sort of lost, that it wasn't exactly the place that I remembered, and I didn't connect with it, and I didn't know why I was there, and it was actually quite hard. Yeah. And then when my son grew up, and eventually, you know, for the first 10 years of his life, we didn't take him to Japan. And then we said, okay, it's time. He's old enough now to enjoy it, and we should go back. So, and we went back, and he just blossomed. He just had this sort of and afterward, he loved every second of it. And he wasn't like he needed to do loads of touristy stuff. He just had an absolute blast. And afterwards I was like, what is it that you like so much? And he said, well, I really like the food, and I like seeing the old temples and stuff. And then he said, and he said, it's nice to be in a place where everybody looks like me.
Yeah.
And that really hit me, really hit
Yeah.
me, you know. And again, you know, that, as you said, in some ways our experiences were different, and I had always, in the UK, I had always been part of the majority.
Yeah.
You know, I'd always been, my sense of alienation from the UK was mostly about class, because I
Yeah.
grew up in an industrial working class
Mhm.
town. But that sense of being the standard of normalcy
Yes.
was
Yeah.
something that was so ingrained in me that I think it's one of the reasons I found Japan so strange and fascinating, and in some ways difficult. And to sort of watch my son have this sort of opposite response was really sort of enlightening and uh, reorienting. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
and he
Wow.
wants to be back there all the time. I mean, not to
Wow.
live there, but he absolutely loves it. You know, we've been back a couple of times since. We were supposed to go this year. I was supposed to be teaching there in the fall at a university in Tokyo for a semester. But because of COVID, all of that has fallen through.
Oh man, that must have been disappointing.
Yeah, yeah. We'll go back. I mean, in some ways,
Yeah.
being in Japan and not having to live according to Japanese work environments is the best way to be there. You
Yeah.
know?
Nice. Nice.
Yeah.
I remember I can go for a little bit more if you
Okay. Yeah.
want to.
I'm having fun.
I'm having fun too. So you and I were regulars at the Fujimi bathhouse,
Yes.
which was a decrepit, rickety old bathhouse that I just love with all my heart. It was
Mhm.
such a great place.
Yeah.
Um, and I just remember, there's so many things I remember about those experiences and being
The old bachan who was like who
there.
ran
Yes,
it.
yes, the Obachan. I remember, I think the first or second time we went, she just stomps right into the dressing room because she needed to see what these naked monkeys look like. So I remember she just comes, she just like, just looks up and then she leaves.
Yes.
She just needed to get an eyeful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember the couple of times I would go there alone because it was right on my way home from Kofu Station to my
Yeah.
apartment. I would go on my own, and it felt so good as I kind of got, as much as the presence of a hairy foreigner can be normalized at a Japanese bathhouse, I think it kind of normalized someone. And I remember the first time I went, there's a lot of old dudes that would hang out there because that's like an old dude thing to do, right?
Yeah.
And I remember I was there and I was in the little squat stool and I was, scrubbing myself, soaping myself to wash myself before I got into the bath. And one of the old dudes just steps out of the hot tub and he just grabs a brush and starts scrubbing my back.
Really?
I was so embarrassed, but I'm just like, this is like he's being helpful, he's being friendly, it's all good. But it was this is like really funny, kind of embarrassing, awkward moment. And I thought, I hope he only wants to scrub my back.
But this is the kind of thing that happened all the time, right? These sort of little moments where it's like, I don't know if they're not thinking of me as like an actual person, or if I'm on this. I don't. Yeah. This.
Like that, I just read it as like just a welcome.
Yeah.
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 Let's make sure you do this right because it's hard to reach your own back. So let me help you with that. So I just read it as trying to be helpful and trying to yeah, because he
Yeah.
saw that I didn't bring like one of those back things that they used to soak their backs with. I didn't have one of those things.
Yeah.
So that
That place, the onsen was not far from Zenkoji Temple, right?
um, it was okay. So if we imagine Kofu Station,
Yeah.
you would hit the Fujimi bathhouse, and then if you kept going, you would hit my apartment, and if you kept going further still, you would hit Zenkoji Temple.
Really, Zenkoji was on your side of the tunnel?
Zenkoji was on my side of the tunnel. Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty sure.
Okay.
Yeah. And apparently Mark Weidman told me that the Fujimi bathhouse was torn down, which I'm kind of not surprised. I mean, it was really decrepit even when we were there. It had a pit toilet, remember that?
Yeah.
So it was definitely like a very old school thing.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad we got to experience something like that, and that we didn't end up trying to hunt down some of the nicer new ones.
Yeah.
That were kind of more well appointed, because I just love that we got to experience
Yeah.
a true neighborhood bathhouse experience.
Yeah.
It was one of the few things that was actually really inexpensive. It was very cheap to go to the bathhouse, and it was actually one of the prime delights of being there, was just going to have a soak, because they really did the water hot.
Yeah.
And that's another thing, is once you leave Japan, you will never experience hot water again, not really hot. And I miss that. Like sometimes you just want to go in there and have it so hot that it turns you into a noodle. That's like,
yeah,
that's the thing.
And everybody goes bright pink, and it's that slightly sulfurous smell to those hot spring waters. Yeah.
Yeah, you want to get properly parboiled.
Yeah.
And you'll never have it again. I've never experienced like real like deep heat like that, and what it does to you and for you.
Yeah,
is really something.
Yeah. You know, speaking of Zenkoji, also the last time we were there, I went back to Zenkoji, and you and I used to go there to take pictures and sketch and paint and stuff. And do you remember there was a little Buddhist statue we called the Green Guy?
Yeah, the Green Guy.
It was covered with, it had this sort of luminescent algae or whatever it was on him.
Lichen or moss, I don't know.
Like, yeah. And still there.
Still there.
Still there, yeah. I mean, in those places, nothing feels like it's changed at all. You know,
it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that all jumped out. And I think the other thing that also would jump out was just places like just going to the Kinokuniya bookstore
in Tokyo.
That was well, there was one in Kofu as well, a much smaller version.
Yeah,
it might have been a different company, Kodansha. No, I can't remember now. But there was the bookstore, and I would go, and that was where I first learned of the wonderland of comic books in Japan. I was a comic book kid. I was a comic book reader from the time I was 8, and then just to arrive, and the diversity of types of comic books was astounding, and the style of illustration was very uniquely theirs. It looks like them and no one else. And of course, now it's become completely normalized, and you know, millions of kids all over in England or here in the United States, they all aspire to draw in that style. My little niece is 11 years old, and she loves drawing. She shows me her sketchbooks. It's all big-eyed girls. It's all that look of that anime. And I remember just leafing through those. And finding a gay one. And I was still, a closeted young person then, but I had to have this comic, and I just thought, shit, we're like public creatures here. Like, people know about us, and buying this gay comic in Kofu is like a really dicey proposition for me, right? But I had to have it, so I just scurried out of there, ran home to read it. Well, read it. I couldn't really read it, but to enjoy the pictures and decipher as best I could what was being said in the story. So
how did you stumble on it?
Pardon me?
How did you stumble on it?
It was in the comic book section, and there's a section where they have kind of more adult stuff.
Right.
So they have all the really quite violent and raunchy hetero porn comics, but then they had this gay one, which was kind of like pretty sexy, kind of romantic. It wasn't like a full-on romance comic, but it also wasn't like a hardcore porny one.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of So that was a big deal. And from that time on, when I would go to Tokyo, I would try to swing by and just load up on those, because in Tokyo, the gift of Tokyo was the gift of anonymity, right? You could just run around and not be known figures. Because we had that. That very small kind of localized celebrity in Yamanashi Prefecture.
Do you think you'll ever go back?
I would love to go back. I hadn't made plans for it, but I would love to go back. As we talk about it, I'm feeling very nostalgic. But the thing is that, like, I think it's also that love of place was also tied to love of friends, to my love of you, my love of my other friends from the teaching program.
Yeah.
I never got to be very chummy with my fellow teachers who were Japanese teachers. I think the language barrier was something, and I think there was a cultural divide there that, they were very cordial and helpful at all times to me. But that's not the same as becoming friends together. But so I think that in some ways, like, there's a part of me that thinks about going back to Kofu in the absence of those people who I made meaning with in Kofu. It'll be a little bit, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that was my first experience the first time I went back, and that was, I think, also part of the reason that it wasn't a super happy experience, and it took another 10 years before I could sort of re-experience and enjoy it. And like you, I mean, I think I had more. My school had more English teachers whose English was good.
Oh, okay.
And so, I did have friends, some of whom I would see occasionally outside school, but I haven't been able to keep again, pre-internet, right? This would not happen now.
Yeah.
If we were there now, we'd be Facebook friends or whatever.
You'd be connected for life.
And you'd be connected for life. But we missed that crucial moment that when we left, it all went away. I had quite a lot of Japanese friends connected through, because I used to teach also at the YMCA, if you remember.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
And I had got a number of friends there, but I have lost touch with everybody, and don't know how to begin reconnecting with them, or, and in some ways it's been, 30 years more.
Yeah.
At this point, it seems a sort of strange thing to do. But we should go back. That would be fun.
It would be fun to go back, I think. Just for shits and giggles, it would be a really great trip.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to go back, as we sort of segue out of our regular jobs. I think we're going to spend more time doing longer trips, and Japan is absolutely top of that list. And also, there are now so many bands that I want to see live that we need a substantial visit. So.
Awesome. Well, keep me in the loop. Maybe
I will.
We'll both get to revisit these familiar and unfamiliar places. The familiar and probably unfamiliar places.
Yeah. Well, it was great to catch up and to have time to sort of, wax nostalgic about.
Extremely so. Wow, I'd forgotten about so much stuff until we just talked about it right now.
Yeah. It was such an incredibly formative time for me, I feel like, and this is part of the thing I was saying about the reverse culture shock of going back to the UK, that I think I came home a very different person.
I feel the same way. I feel like it was one of the most, one of the 3 or 4 most formative experiences was spending that. And it was just 2 years.
Yeah.
It really wasn't that long, and it passed very quickly. And I feel like the echoes of it are still so resonant for me.
Very much so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe we will do something like this again. Maybe we will get to sort of reconnect in person someday soon, and maybe even we'll go back to Japan one day.
Sounds good.
All right, man. Thank you.
Good to see you.
And that's it. As ever, if you had fun with this, like, comment, subscribe. We are at the end of the year, end of 2021. Hopefully we are looking at a better 2022. Hopefully I'll be able to get to Japan in the coming year. And hopefully it'll be a better year for everybody else as well. And so until my next video, all the best. Happy holidays. See you in 2022.